Hello and welcome. My name is Matt Rajansky. I'm director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation today with Special Envoy for Belarus, Julie Fisher, and the EU's Head of Delegation to Belarus, Ambassador Dirk Schuebel. We, of course, will be discussing the acute crisis situation in terms of migrants on Belarus's borders created, I think, intentionally by the regime, as well as the broader context of US and European relations with Belarus at a time of great tension in the region and apparent real risks of conflict, particularly between Russia and Ukraine. So there's a tremendous amount of context to take into account with today's discussion. But first, let me thank my colleagues in the Wilson Center's Global Europe and Middle East programs for co-sponsoring today's event. And note that anybody who wants to ask a question, and the questions are already coming in, which I'm thrilled about, the more questions, the better. You can email them to Kennan, Kennan, at wilsoncenter.org. You can also tweet them at Kennan Institute, and you can post them to our Facebook page at any time throughout the discussion, though obviously the sooner you get them in, the more likely I'll get them. Also more likely I'll be able to ask your question if you include your name and affiliation. So please do that as well. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce both distinguished speakers today. I'm going to let them offer their opening remarks, and then we'll go right to discussion, and we will keep to an hour as promised. So first, Special Envoy Julie Fisher, who was, following confirmation by the Senate, sworn in as the first US ambassador to the Republic of Belarus since 2008 in December of 2020. She previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Europe and the EU in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. Prior to that, she was the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States to NATO, leading preparations for the 2018 Brussels Summit and the move to the new NATO headquarters. She's also served as Chief of Staff to the Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, supporting reform efforts involving knowledge management, human resources, and security in US facilities abroad. She was also the director of the Operations Center at the State Department. As many of you will know, that is the 24/7 team facilitating communications for the State Department's senior principals and officers around the globe. From 2011 to 13, in support of the NATO Secretary General, Ambassador Fisher was detailed to the NATO staff as Deputy Director of the Private Office. She has also served in assignments at US embassies in Tbilisi, Georgia, Kiev, Ukraine, and Moscow, Russia, as well as tours in the NSC, the Bureau for European Affairs and Near Eastern Affairs, and as a member of the Executive Secretariat working under the Secretary of State. Ambassador Dirk Schuebel is the EU's head of delegation to Belarus since 2019, but he has also served in the past as the head of delegation and ambassador in the Republic of Moldova, where I had the pleasure of visiting with him, and head of the political, press, and information section of the EU's delegation in Ukraine. He's also worked as both head of division for Russia and head of division for bilateral relations with the Eastern Partnership in the European Union's External Action Service. Before beginning with the External Action Service, Ambassador Schuebel worked in the European Commission's Directorate Generals dealing with transport and energy, enlargement, and also trade. As many of you will know, those topics are very closely linked to the Eastern Partnership, association agreements, and so forth. He started his professional career in the German Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs and holds a degree in foreign trade and international commercial relations. So without further delay, we'll begin with you. The Zoom room is yours, and then we'll go directly to Ambassador Schuebel.
Super. Thank you, Matt. Thanks very much. Really big thanks to the team at the Wilson Center, at the Kennan Institute for this opportunity today to talk about really a very urgent situation in Belarus, and for having the opportunity to do so alongside Dirk Schuebel. Let me say Ambassador Schuebel, and by extension his team at the EU delegation in Minsk, are absolutely essential partners for us, for me personally, for the US Embassy in Minsk. And so it feels exactly right to have a conversation together about what is happening today and what we see as both opportunity and risk going forward. So Matt, before we started, you noted that there's some real experts in this crowd. And so I don't want to be redundant for any of them who are actually directly involved in US-Belarus relations. over the course of the last 30 years. So let me perhaps not go so far back, but simply note that let me start my remarks by going back to 2014, because I think that was a real inflection point for US-Belarus relations following the expulsion of our ambassador in 2008 and the minimal diplomatic relationship that we had with Belarus. In 2014, after Russia's illegal occupation of Ukraine, we saw Alexander Lukashenka take a look around and consider or reconsider his relationship with the West. And as part of that, there were some slow but thoughtful steps that occurred at that time. Those steps included the release of political prisoners, the lessening of US sanctions, again, slowly, thoughtfully, not in a rush. And really, there was an opportunity for increased direct engagement. That culminated for us on the United States side, this really culminated in the visit of Secretary Pompeo in February of 2020, which was the most senior engagement we had with Belarus in 25 years at that point. So that was a real moment of opportunity. February of 2020, not just our relationship, but the relationship with the West writ large really was full of promise. So when the election time came around, beginning in the late spring of 2020, and we observed as Alexander Lukashenka decided that he would prevent the viable and competitive opposition candidates from running against him in the presidential election, we knew that was a troubling sign about his step backwards from his engagement with the West. So we saw that. And then there was the actual fraudulent election itself. And then there was the violence that followed as the regime violently attacked peaceful protesters. During this time, we watched the expulsion of Polish and Latvian, Lithuanian, and other diplomats, not just ambassadors, but a range of diplomats. Then in May of 2021, everyone, I think, if they've tuned into this, they are keenly aware of the forced diversion of the Ryanair flight, which was flying from one EU capital to another, forced to divert to Minsk for the sole purpose of arresting an opposition blogger. And so this most recent outrage, with the regime using false promises to entice thousands of migrants to Belarus, where they have been suffering in the cold, as the regime has manipulated their desperation, is very much consistent with what we have seen out of Alexander Lukashenka in the last 15 months, right? As he desperately clings to power. There is, so far, there is really very little he hasn't been willing to do to maintain that grip on power. So the question, I think, for our discussion today, of course, is what does this mean for the United States and what does this mean for our closest partners? So for our part, President Biden has said repeatedly, human rights belong at the center of our foreign policy, and we have to reassert our moral leadership on the global stage. Many who are taking part in this will know well that at the OSCE, all participating states have made commitments with regard to fundamental freedoms. And they've also agreed that adherence to those fundamental freedoms is a matter for all participating states. As of today, nearly all NGOs and independent media outlets have been driven out of existence or into exile. More than 870 political prisoners languish in Lukashenko's jails, being held for their independent views, their truthful reporting, or even something as simple as the color of their socks. Tens of thousands of Belarusians have been forced to flee the country. Millions of Belarusians are looking to and counting on the West to be their voice. And it is the political crisis, and so therefore we will continue to speak out and respond to the regime's violence. So let's be clear here. It is the political crisis that Lukashenka has generated that has put individual Belarusians, the traveling public, and Belarus's neighbors in harm's way. So how are we responding? In a variety of different ways, and I know we will get into this more deeply as we get into questions, but a couple of things that I'd like to note. First of all, President Biden has identified the struggle of democracy versus autocracy as a key challenge for our time. And in this vein, he will be hosting a virtual summit for democracy in December to bring together world leaders to make commitments on defending democracy. On Belarus, we are already working with other democracies, and we stand with the European Union and our partners and allies consistently calling for a way out of the crisis. And the way out of that crisis, in our view, has been clear. The unconditional release of all political prisoners, the engagement by the regime in a meaningful dialogue with the democratic forces that, number 3, leads to a new election under international observation. Because the actions taken by the Lukashenko regime affect Belarus's neighbors, including our EU partners and NATO allies. It is because of that that we deeply appreciate the leadership shown by Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland in confronting the challenges generated by the regime. And we fully recognize the hardships they have faced as a result. We stand in solidarity with them. The Lukashenko regime bears full responsibility for these actions, which I have mentioned. And this is why the West remains united in using sanctions tools to change the trajectory in Minsk. The United States and the EU have both made it clear that more sanctions pressure is coming soon. But we also understand that Russia stands ready to take advantage of a crisis for its own benefit. We are concerned that the migrant crisis has diverted attention away from Russia's military buildup near Ukraine, and have urged our partners to keep a close eye on the region as well. Russian disinformation efforts use actions in Belarus, such as the migrant crisis, to stoke tensions and undermine European unity and transatlantic unity. But it is important to recognize that Moscow has influence, unique influence, over the Lukashenko regime. And we welcome Moscow using that influence in a way that moves Belarus forward. As long as the regime in Belarus refuses to respect its international obligations and commitments, undermines the peace and security of Europe, and continues to repress and abuse people seeking to live in freedom, we will continue to pressure the Lukashenko regime, and we will not lessen our calls for accountability. And we're going to do so in support of and together with the EU, its member states, and our allies. Thanks, and over to you, Dirk.
Please. Thank you so much, Ambassador Fischer. Ambassador Schuebel.
Yes, a very good evening from Brussels. Matt, good to see you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion today. I am also likewise very pleased to do that together with my dear colleague and friend, if I may say so, Julie Fischer. We have worked indeed extremely closely together over the last few months throughout the year of 2021. And we, of course, will continue doing so. And just to say, it has been really a pleasure to work together because we share the very same objectives. Well, firstly, the fact that I'm speaking from Brussels to you shows you already that I'm not in Minsk where I should be, because I have had the pleasure to present my credentials to then still President Lukashenko in September 2019. But I was asked at the end of June to leave Minsk for consultations, as I was told, to Brussels, and I've been consulting ever since in headquarters here in Brussels. So I will not repeat everything that Julie said on the past, because we share exactly the same assessment of the situation, and also the positive assessment of the situation a few years ago. I had the same feelings when I started my job in September 2019, that I came with positive emotions overall without having any enthusiasm, and I wanted to build up a decent relationship with Belarus as an independent country. Unfortunately, things have developed differently than we all wanted it to be. But I wanted to come straight into the topic of today's discussion, namely migration. I think we have to acknowledge that the situation in Belarus has deteriorated further over the last few weeks. The political crisis that started last year after the rigged presidential elections and that was followed by violence and repressions has now turned into a full humanitarian, geopolitical, and also regional security crisis. After the forced landing of the Ryanair passenger flight on the 23rd of May, Lukashenko went even further by launching a politically motivated hybrid action against its neighbors. All this refers, of course, to a clear pattern: the orchestrated instrumentalization of human beings for political purposes. It has one clear objective, which is to destabilize the neighboring countries and to divert attention from its own increasing human rights violations. Julie Fisher mentioned the numbers, I don't repeat them. Since 2 weeks, the crisis has not only intensified, has only intensified, and we all have seen shocking images from thousands of people which are stuck at the border with Poland, but also with Lithuania and Latvia. Despite some signs of improvement last week stemming from our own outreach efforts, namely several airlines stopped boarding citizens of certain countries on flights to Minsk. The Iraqi authorities are organizing emergency repatriation flights, but still the situation remains very worrying and Minsk continues to escalate the tensions. This tactic, obviously, of the Belarusian authorities is unacceptable. It has become a threat to international peace and security, and we will not tolerate this. And let me also say there are no negotiations with the Lukashenko regime. He created this crisis. He brought these people to Belarus by lying to them about easy access to the EU, and they are on Belarusian territory. So it is his responsibility now to solve the crisis and take care of these people, allow access to international organizations, and to help those in need, and to allow the repatriation of the people he brought into the country. We as EU, we are ready to contribute to alleviating the humanitarian aspects with support of the UN agencies. We have already allocated 700,000 euros in humanitarian assistance to the International Federation of the Red Cross for vulnerable migrants which are stranded at the border. We can be helpful in 3 areas. First, we want to provide humanitarian aid to the suffering people on the ground, the migrants. Secondly, we can contribute to helping moving migrants away from the border to some temporary accommodation. And third, for those who would like to, we are ready to help with the repatriation of the migrants. While we are talking, there are 2 colleagues, technical from the team of the humanitarian team of the EU Commission in Minsk, and they are holding talks both with the UN agencies, also with some Belarusian counterparts at working level in order to facilitate all these issues. We should, however, remain vigilant against the risk of a further escalation and provocation by Belarus at the border with the EU, because Belarus, with some political backing from Russia, is testing the EU solidarity, also including with the help of a massive disinformation campaign. We continue to monitor the implications for the security of the EU and the neighboring countries, and we must be ready to provide an adequate and united response. And obviously, we stand in full solidarity with the member states which are affected by this hybrid attack, and we will continue assisting those most directly impacted. So this is not a crisis only for Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. It's a crisis in which the whole European Union is impacted. Therefore, we will be, and we are, and we will continue to be at the forefront of the international reactions towards Lukashenko's actions. We have stayed in this contact, in very close contact with our like-minded partners, with the US, of course, in particular, but also with others, with the United Kingdom, with Switzerland, with Japan, and other partners. And just to repeat that our cooperation, in particular with the US, has been excellent. And we are very grateful that there has always been a very strong interest on the US side to line up actions with us in response to blatant violations by the Lukashenko regime. Our leaders have committed to build a more democratic, peaceful, and secure world. And I think the action that Julie announced, the virtual summit for democracy by President Biden, I think it's the best example for that. We believe that our strong and reliable partnership with the US is essential to stand up for democracy and human rights and to find joint answers to these challenges. With regard to Belarus, we believe that we must address the root causes of political instability. But what we are witnessing today is massive repressions against the Belarusian people and intensifying acts of transnational repression. In order to face this, we have adopted 4 increasingly biting packages of targeted sanctions measures against individuals and entities linked to the Lukashenko regime. And just recently at their meeting on the 15th of November, the EU foreign ministers agreed to broaden the scope for sanctions to tackle those involved in and contributing to activities by the Lukashenko regime that facilitate the illegal crossing of external borders into the European Union. This includes blacklisting airlines, travel agencies, and other intermediaries that are active in human trafficking. And a fifth sanctions package is currently being discussed with member states, and it's due to get out in a very short time. And we obviously will also coordinate this, have continued and will continue to coordinate this with the US and other partners on the further use of these restrictive measures to pursue our shared foreign policy and security objectives. Countering disinformation, perhaps this is as a last point, also remains key. It is not only Russia now that is spreading disinformation, the Russian leadership, but also Lukashenko. And again, here together with the United States, we need to strengthen our strategic resilience to counter efficiently hybrid threats, including disinformation. And also we need to be well coordinated to pass our clear messages to the regime. There is no way we consider changing our approach. Julie mentioned already the points that Lukashenko needs to meet. These are exactly the points that are mentioned in the October 2020 conclusions of the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union. And we have said many times that it's up to the Lukashenko regime to reverse this spiral of confrontation. And the only thing that is needed is his action and to reverse all the violations that happened so far and that forced the EU and other democratic partners to introduce its restrictive measures. I'll stop here. Happy to answer your questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ambassador Schuebel and also Ambassador Fischer. Just a reminder for, we have a number of questions coming in. Anyone else, Kenan@wilsoncenter.org. You can email your question, you can tweet it to us or post it to Facebook, and please include your name and affiliation. So starting with my questions though, look, I think in the big picture, the strategy question that is most often on the minds of those of us who've watched Belarus and Belarus-West relations for a long time is kind of this repetition of history problem, right? The cycles. I was in Belarus as an OSCE election observer in 2010. And I remember the kind of raised hopes and expectations of the months leading up to that election. Then, you know, the regime's repressive response, creating new political prisoners, using those political prisoners as bargaining chips, you know, cracking down on people protesting, you know, the kind of the hand clapping protests, the silent protests, the whole cycle. You know, maybe there wasn't, you know, some of the features that we've seen now, the hybrid attacks on neighbors, et cetera. It's a different geopolitical environment. You know, but the question is really pretty straightforward, and that is compare, if you will, where we are now in the wake of, you know, another cycle of raised expectations and hopes, and then crackdown and repression by the regime. Compare that to last time, and help us maybe understand why, if this time is different, why is it different in terms of, you know, what we should expect from the other side, but also what we may be willing to offer. Because I think a lot of folks remember 2014, you pointed that out, Ambassador Fischer, you know, suddenly there was this breakthrough, right? And things started to get better again. So I just think it'd be very useful to compare these two cycles, if you could. Either one of you like to begin.
Julie, why don't you start?
Sure, happy to. Look, Matt, I think the patterns is a really important question when it comes to Belarus. And just so that I'm clear, as we talk about these issues, I am probably the person on this who is part of this conversation who has never been to Belarus. So you have been there as an election observer. I imagine you've probably been there as well in other capacities. Ambassador Schuebel, in fact, was on the ground there. I have not been. So, you know, I have worked incredibly closely with the US Embassy in Minsk. I am now in Vilnius. These are patterns that I have followed for some time, but I do want to be clear on that one point. Look, I think it is the patterns that make 2020, 2021 different from what has happened previously. It is because of the repetition. It is because we have seen this movie before that, in fact, I think there is no appetite in the West to get into the business of trading off whether it is small numbers of political prisoners. There is, or I think, a realization in 2020 and 2021 that that there isn't going to be there is no comeback from the violence that has been perpetrated this time, because it is, the violence that was brought to the people in the street. It is the numbers who were detained and held and tortured as a result of those protests last fall. It is the intentional inflicting, overfilling prisons and then ensuring that those who are in the individual cells get COVID, right? There is no coming back from this. There is no turning the page or turning the corner on it, in my mind. And so, Ryanair, if we think back to the end of May of this year, I recall just the shock that the international community had, right, in light of this, that this was unprecedented, this kind of transnational repression. And just when we thought the new low had been reached, then we see, how it is that Lukashenka and his regime have used human beings, how they have trafficked them, how they have callously put them on the borders with Belarus's neighbors for their own political purposes. And so, all of this is what contributes to the sense that this is so entirely different from some of the repression of what we saw in the past, because it overshadows it so significantly.
Yes, if I may add a few words, I think, first of all, I fully agree with Julie. This is not the same situation in which we are, and I will give you a few examples. First of all, we are seeing an externalization, an internationalization of a domestic conflict which didn't exist in 2010, 2011. So both the actions against the Ryanair flight and also now what we see on migration, that is a totally different scenario than we have seen in 2011, where a few hundred people or a few thousand people who were demonstrating, where there was a crackdown on those. And we had altogether, if I remember correctly, we counted 29 political prisoners. Today, 873, if I'm correctly informed, state of play today. So compare 29 with 873, you see also a big difference. And I would like to mention a third item, which is different or two items, in fact, which are different from the past time of 2010-11. It is the COVID pandemic and the reaction by Lukashenko and the regime to this pandemic, which basically was zero, no reaction. It was ridiculized by him, and that my belief is that cost him also many sympathies by those people in Belarus, which are perhaps in normal circumstances not so negative about him. So that cost him, I think, quite a few percentage points of votes in the elections. And secondly, he had, of course, this time really serious competitors, or would-be competitors, if I may say so. Viktor Babariko was a very serious competitor who can easily run this country. I think we can say that. And of course, also the husband of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, Sergei Tikhanovsky, who would probably have more attracted the less educated part of the population, but not only. I think also he was a strong competitor too, and he was very popular. That you could see when they were starting to collect votes to be registered for the presidential elections. So I think all of these items make the situation different this time, and in particular the internationalization of the conflict, I think, makes it impossible that anyone in Europe, and I'm sure the same goes for the US and other democratic countries, will go back to normalcy at some stage and will do this another turnaround as we have seen in 2010, 2011.
Okay, thank you both. So we have half an hour. We have a lot of questions from a lot of names that you will probably know, and they're great questions. So I am going to actually forego my opportunity to ask many more follow-ups because, quite frankly, the questions get to them. So if we can keep answers fairly compact, I think we can get through a lot of these. But of course, you use your judgment. The first question is explicitly directed to you, Ambassador Fisher. It's from Paul Shinkman, the national security correspondent for US News and World Report. And he asks, to what do you attribute the deployment of Russian military forces to Belarus? Could it be for any reason other than attempting to pressure or provoke Ukraine? I think there's a sort of implicit question in there about Russia's intentions towards Belarusian sovereignty.
Thanks. It's a good question. I think it's important when we consider Russian military presence in Belarus that we take really that we take a holistic and longer term view than simply what has happened either in the last 30 days or the last 60 days since the Zapad exercise, or even the course of the year, right? Because this is a military relationship. This is a security relationship of one that is been increasing in dependence, Belarus's dependence on Russia over decades. So it is important not simply to look at the movement of forces in recent days or weeks, but also to take that longer term snapshot. So the question of whether or not there's only one reason for it, I think would be a bit of an oversimplification of the situation.
Ambassador
Schuebel, anything on that?
Well, I personally think that one should not only look from the Ukraine angle on this. I think there is also an interest, of course, for the Russian side to be present in the military, on the military side in Belarus. They've always been, and we have always discussed this in the framework of the next Zapad military exercise that just took place in September again. But I think overall, I think it is in general terms in Russian interest, of course, to be militarily present in Belarus, and I would see it in that context in the first place.
Okay, thanks. The next question comes from Ambassador George Kroll. As some of you will know, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Belarus, as well as Kazakhstan, and very recently retired. I'm just going to read his question. It's somewhat lengthy, but I think it's well worth reading. The reality appears to be that the Belarusian government, with which the US and EU still maintain diplomatic relations, accepts Lukashenka as president without any significant defection. If the US and EU do not recognize Lukashenka as president, how can the US and EU talk with the Belarusian government directly to resolve the issues regarding Belarus? Do the US and EU consider the Belarusian opposition in Vilnius as a government in exile, which would seem to make the Belarusian government in Minsk illegitimate? Or are the US and the EU looking at Moscow as the mediator? Unfortunately, it does not seem sanctions will cause Lukashenka to budge, but only forces him to dig deeper. Do the US and EU really think sanctions of any severity will cause Lukashenka and Russia to change? Or is this wishful thinking and largely posturing? So lots of question marks in that paragraph. Address as much as you can, please. And thank you so much, Ambassador Kroll, for the question.
Julie, want to start again?
I was going to suggest you start on this one, but you take as much of it as you'd like.
I can. Okay, then I'll
okay.
Start. Very fair question by Ambassador Kroll, and good to hear from you. Well, first of all, the first thing to say is we do not accept Lukashenko as president. We have made this very clear. And look at the recent statement by the German government when still Chancellor Merkel spoke to Lukashenko. The official statement says Herr Lukashenko, Mr. Lukashenko, in no unclear terms, and that is how we see him. So we have been very clear also in our demands that we demand new presidential elections because we do not recognize these elections of August 2020, and that means we do not recognize him as a president. So I think since 5th of November, if I'm not mistaken, 2020, Lukashenko is no longer the president of this country. So any new president, for any new president to be elected, new elections would need to take place. And these elections would need to be, of course, in conformity with international obligations and requirements observed by the OSCE, etc. Moscow mediator. Well, I think what we can say is, what we can safely say is, if there is anyone who can influence on the situation in Belarus and on Lukashenko, it's the Kremlin, it's Moscow. So obviously we have also asked Moscow to see to it and to help to limit the excessive steps that Lukashenko has taken vis-a-vis his own population. Unfortunately, so far to not much avail. But if there's someone who can influence on Lukashenko, it is obviously Mr. Putin and the Kremlin. Sanctions, once again, the objective of our sanctions is not to bring someone down or to bring him out of his office. Of course, that is what many people, in fact, would like to see. But the main objective of our sanctions is, of course, to demonstrate that certain actions that have been taken by those who are under sanctions are not acceptable to the European Union and to our people, because they are against our values and they violate international norms. That is why we introduce sanctions. That is not to bring someone down or not, whether we like it or not. And that is why it takes always a considerable amount of time and discussion inside the European Union among 27 member states until we get to a new package. Although in the case of Belarus, we have been on a number of packages actually relatively fast for our standards. And as I said, the fifth package is underway. And obviously we have to hope that this will lead to Lukashenko rethinking whether he will do it. Only he can reply to, only he can answer, but we of course have this hope.
Thanks for jumping in first. Thanks, Ambassador Kroll, for the question. It's always wonderful to hear from a former boss. But I think, you know, I find there is an entire, you know, it's probably not limited to Washington, but there is a parlor game around the question of legitimacy. It's probably the question I spend the most time answering. And I was answering this question with regards to the presentation of credentials and willing or not willing, these kinds of I think really inside the house kinds of questions. And what I believe matters most about legitimacy with regards to Lukashenko is the question of whether or not he has legitimacy in the eyes of the people of Belarus. Do they believe that there was an election that produced a result that gives them the legitimacy to govern the nation? And you know, there's a reason that the political crisis persists, and it is because it is understood in Belarus that he lacks this legitimacy, that he lacks it in terms of the conduct of the election. And maybe going back to the last question a little bit, you know, one of the things that is very different from 2010 is just how much evidence there is about the fraudulent nature of that election. And therefore, and in many cases, how comical some of the efforts to cook the results were, because they were so evident to so many. And so, look, we have diplomatic relations. We have not, we continue to have diplomats on the ground in Minsk. There continues to be a Belarusian embassy in Washington. So the question of whether or not we can speak to each other is not one that is wrapped up in the question of the legitimacy of the election. The question as it relates to how do we view those in exile, right? There is, of course, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya and her team are in Vilnius. Other members of the Coordination Council are in Warsaw, they're in Kyiv. Increasingly, we are seeing Belarusians look to go to Tbilisi. You know, the fact is, again, that I think, you know, there are real indications that if we understood the results from August of 2020, we would see that she, not only did she likely win the vote outright, but that she carried it with a pretty significant margin. There's no way to prove it. There was no international observation, you know, given all of the fraud, it's not knowable. So hence the call for the new election. So for a leader to maintain legitimacy in the eyes of the people of Belarus, a new election is required. So that takes us back to that point. Again, on sanctions, let me just simply add to Ambassador Schuebel's excellent remarks on this point. Let me just say for our part, right, these are very much about driving to a result. They're not they're not designed simply to be punitive. They are designed to drive to a result. And I would say just two quick things about sanctions. One, they are not overnight tools. And two, simply because you don't see it reported on Twitter or in the New York Times doesn't mean that there isn't some evidence of progress in this area. So I think these are tools that require time as an element of the pressure when it comes to sanctions.
Well, thank you both. We have a lot of great questions, so I'm going to try to get to as many of them as I can, but what I might do is ask a few of them together, and you can each sort of note the pieces that you'd like to cover, and that way we'll cover more of them. In a way, I think picking up a piece of Ambassador Kroll's question, another former US ambassador to Minsk, Ambassador Ken Yalowitz, has the following question, and I'll just underscore a part of it. He asks, have the Ryanair piracy and the migrant border crisis given a boost to the opposition, or have they been marginalized for now by Lukashenka's brutal tactics? And are there any cracks in the security forces' support for Lukashenka? And this is now me talking, let me underscore that last piece. We did obviously see some of that around the time of the protests last year, people turning in their police uniforms and so forth. But I also think that gets back to Ambassador Kroll's question of kind of who do you talk to within the system when the head of the system has made himself illegitimate in this way. That's one question. If you'll bear with me, a question from Abraham Mashi, who's the Pentagon editor for Air Force magazine. He asks, can you please describe the military security concerns at the border, how Russia is involved, and how the EU and NATO can assure border security without provoking Belarus and Russia to military escalation? So let me leave that set of questions, if I can, for the moment, and ask for your fairly brief responses.
All right, I'm going to say that I think it's unfair for you to lob 20 questions all at once and then say keep it brief. But wonderful to hear from Ambassador Yalowitz as well. And let me maybe address as quickly as I can. I think that Ryanair and the migration crisis, look, both of these are these outrageous acts of transnational repression and evidence of Lukashenka taking what he does at home, taking that approach outside his borders or to the border, as in the second case. I don't think there's any sense from those I talk with in the democratic forces who think that this is right. There's nothing positive in this. It continues to keep focus on the fact that if we the West do not address the political crisis in Belarus, we will continue to see these kinds of related crises like Ryanair, like the migration crisis. So it adds a level of urgency to the West addressing the political crisis. I would say on the question of the very large question about military and security postures on the borders and EU and NATO border security. Let me maybe just make one distinction because I come from a NATO background. Let me just say this, right? Border security is an EU competence. It is not, border security is not a NATO competence, right? So first and foremost, the EU, as they have responded so quickly and so urgently in this crisis in a variety of ways, the EU is addressing this as a migration and border security challenge. From the NATO perspective, right? I think we keep a close eye on this because we think about the hybrid dynamics, we think about the hybrid efforts, we also think about the regional military and security dynamics associated with it. That, to me, is NATO's role in this. And so it's absolutely critical. I would say, We are working so very closely, if I haven't made this abundantly clear, we in the United States, Dirk will speak to the EU side, but in the United States, so closely with Warsaw and incredibly closely with Vilnius and with Riga to ensure that we have a full understanding of the security dynamics related to these crises. So I'll turn it back over, trying to be short.
All right.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, valiant.
If I may add a few things from my side. A very good question. Of course. Let me start also from the end, perhaps on the border security issues. Indeed, this is an EU competency. It is the Ministers of Interior of the EU member states, of course, who deal with border security, and not necessarily the Ministers of Defense. So obviously, we have made available all the support, basically from the very beginning, that is from May, June onwards, to the three countries concerned. In the beginning, as you know, when the crisis appeared, was mainly Lithuania concerned, because the first migrants marched direction Lithuania, then Latvia and Poland, basically only as a third. But then, in the meantime, obviously, Poland has taken the largest part of the migrants' attacks in the last few weeks, in particular. So we have made available expertise, financial resources to all three countries. We have as you know, we have a border security agency. It's called Frontex, the European Border Security Agency. So we have offered our services. I think in particular Lithuania and Latvia have used that. Poland can use it if it needs it. So far, Poland has said it doesn't need this support, but obviously we stand ready. And obviously, we have also reached out to the third countries from where these migrants are coming. So we have reached out to altogether 13 potential, migrant originator countries. Of course, most prominently to Iraq, quite successfully, by the way, as I described in my introductory remarks, but also to other countries like transit countries like Turkey. So all of this we will continue, of course, and we hope that indeed. That will also lead to bigger success, that this migrant flow will stop sooner or later. Marginalization of the opposition through Ryanair and migration. I don't think that, first of all, I would not speak about marginalization. I think you see where Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, on which level she is received worldwide, I should say. She met Joe Biden and President Biden in October, I think it was, and she's meeting heads of state and government throughout Europe, basically, with very few exceptions, and that means she is recognized as a very important leader of the opposition and leader of the Belarusian people, if you want. So I think to speak of a marginalization of the opposition is really not right. It's a different situation also in this respect. I think we have a different type of opposition. We have many more people supporting these people, these opposition figures. The opposition is widespread. It's not only a few dozen people. It comes from all sides, from all levels of the society. So I think we have not the same situation, and we have a strong support. And this, I do not see any this support not waning. To be honest, I think in particular Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has big support, of course. Who do we talk to in the system? Well, we're talking, whether we like it or not, Lukashenko and his people have the power in the country still. So if we want to help the people on some very limited issues, we have to talk to them, or to some of them. We talk mainly on working level and not on a higher level. The highest level we usually talk to is Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. We hardly have any contacts with other ministries. But with the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, that is the channel that we have kept open and that we intend to keep open to come to some solution. In particular, also now, seeing this humanitarian crisis, we have to talk to the regime if we want to find solutions for those poor people who are stranded there, and that is why we're doing it. I think that's more or less what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you both. In the 10 minutes or so we have remaining, I would really like to get 2 more rounds of questions in if we can. Your objection has been noted, Ambassador Fisher. It's utterly unfair, but do your best, please. And first, to give you just a sense of the many questions and comments coming in from members of the Belarusian diaspora in the United States. Mila Martinez says, I'm a Belarusian living in the USA. First of all, I'd like to thank you for all the efforts supporting Belarus. Thank you for keeping Belarus on the international agenda. But then asks, I think Lukashenka should be named what he really is, an international terrorist. What is the possibility of formally assigning him the status of an international terrorist? And then Olga Jekyll asks, why do you think 4 rounds of US and EU sanctions are not working? The economy in Belarus is doing better this year than last. Why is the US government so soft on Lukashenka? What else could the US do? And notes also the IMF is allocating 1 billion of SDRs to Lukashenka. There's a rumor that additional billions are coming. We know Lukashenka will find a way to turn it into cash with help from China or Russia. We know he'll spend it to pay special forces to keep terrorizing his citizens. Why does the US allow this? It undoes the work the government has done with sanctions. So to give you a sense, kind of there are others, but if you guys both would like to comment on that, and then we'll go to a final round.
Okay, my speed answers on these are going to be the question of terrorist designation. I think is, as we look at these questions, fundamentally, in my mind, there are legal definitions and legal requirements, and we, I think, are focusing on what is most meaningful in terms of moving us forward towards those 3 goals as I enunciated them, right? Is it going to help us get the political prisoners released? Is it going to help push towards that meaningful dialogue? Is it going to help lead us to new elections? These are some of the questions that we ask ourselves as we consider these kinds of proposals, like designation of Lukashenko as a terrorist. There's a lot more legal answer to that I'm going to not go into. 4 rounds of sanctions not working. So this is, I think, a particularly important question. And what I would like to point out is that I think, as the West has responded to what happened before, during, and the post-election period, the sanctions actions started off, I would say, with a slow roll, right? It is only the most recent sanctions that were rolled out by the United States in August of 2021, where we really expanded our authorities. What we did in August was so important in my mind, because what we announced was we're going to have a much broader set of authorities to bring economic pressure to bear, and that we're going to have a broader set of targets that we can go after. And so we announced the first of those with that August executive order. And again, these are some of the strongest sanctions we have rolled out to date against Belarus. And in some cases, those haven't even yet taken effect because of general licensing around that. So I would say it's premature to say sanctions aren't working. On the IMF and special drawing rights, SDRs, I would say my quick 30-second answer on this is the IMF is a rules-based organization. And in fact, there are rules around this. I do not anticipate any additional SDRs going to Belarus in the coming years. That is not foreseen. But I think the question of changing rules is a separate one to be considered on this question.
Yes, from my side, again, fully agree with Julie. Definition of an international terrorist, a lot of conditions need to be fulfilled. I'm not a lawyer, but what I've seen so far, it is not easy to make this work, and I think I leave that to experts to look into this. So as much as many of us would like that to happen, you need a lot of conditions to be fulfilled, and only then this can materialize. 4 rounds of sanctions, of EU sanctions, don't work. First of all, I do not have the impression that there is no effect at all, because I can tell you that, in particular, before the 4th round, we have had many visitors and many letters and phone calls of mainly visitors who of around the regime who were not happy to be possibly considered. They didn't know because we don't discuss this publicly, but they asked for meetings with a number of ambassadors, in particular of EU member states, where they possibly have some business interests. Some of them came to see us, EU. They have been active here on the ground in Brussels. So I would not say that there is no effect. Some, in particular, businessmen close to the regime are not happy to be considered for sanctions and do not want to be put on that list. The same goes now. I can tell you one example, Belarus. I can tell this because they're doing it publicly. They're doing their utmost. The CEO of Belarus, the Belarusian airline, state airline, trying their utmost to prove that they have nothing to do with migrants transports from country X to Belarus. And why? Because they do not want to be put on the sanctions list. So I think sanctions that they don't work, we cannot say. And again, what is it to define that sanctions work? We have an annual analysis of our sanctions. So we're waiting now for this analysis. We see how that will what our experts will come up with, and then we will also possibly adapt the sanctions in case indeed they wouldn't work in the way that they have been set up right now. IMF, yes, IMF has, I don't know how many members, close to 200, I guess. And obviously, while you have a value-based institution, you have also so many member states that interpret these values, unfortunately, not the same way that we in the Western democracies interpret them. So none of us has been happy when this decision was taken. But as far as I know, so far, the regime has not been able to put these special drawing rights into cash, into national currency, into currencies. So let's see whether they succeed. But indeed, I also haven't heard anything about any additional funding coming from that end.
Okay, thank you both. And now we'll just do a final round of fairly diverse questions, but from names I think you know. Ambassador Jennifer Brush, who served in Moldova and the Balkans, asks a great question. Can sports crazy Belarus and its athletes be banned from sporting events, i.e. the IOC, FIFA, International Tennis Federation? Does Russia have a veto in all these organizations? Minsk already has a precedent of threatening athletes. And then from Scott Rowland, who served as charge in Minsk, he asks, and I apologize for condensing this, about the plight of local employees in Belarus who the regime required to be terminated. What efforts are USAID and the Department of State making to assist these employees? Can they be granted special immigrant visas? And what efforts are made to hire any of them who wish to leave Belarus to work for state or aid from outside Belarus? And Scott also asks a great question about efforts to develop information and entertainment programming in Russian in order to offer an alternative to the wide range of programming that Russia broadcasts into Belarus 24/7. Particularly, he's focusing on sports and entertainment content, which options are only in Russian at this point. So really quite a diverse set of questions, and I'd invite you also to sort of add any final remarks you may have. And we'll spill over a tiny bit, but I think it's okay. So who wants to start?
Dirk, you please go first, if you'd like.
Okay, thanks a lot, Julie. Well, Jennifer, good to see you virtually at least. We served together during our Moldova times. Sport is, of course, a very interesting topic, and I think the regime had already to suffer from some big defeats. The Ice Hockey World Championship 2020 that was supposed to take place jointly in both Riga, Latvia, and in Minsk was taken away from Minsk, and the Ice Hockey World Championship took place only in Riga, to give one example. Also, some sponsors who were supposed to sponsor some international events in Belarus withdrew their agreement to sponsor it. They were now banned by which is ridiculous, to be honest. They were banned by the regime. So Nivea, if you know the company, products can no longer be promoted there or sold there in Belarus. Skoda car company was also a main sponsor, also not allowed anymore. So, but in the end, it was a defeat for them. Also, international football matches, for instance, soccer in American, they don't take place anymore in Belarus. So some of the Belarusian teams that play in European competitions, they're playing mainly in Russia nowadays, these competitions. So they basically have home advantage is taken away from them playing at home. And a number of other examples. There's a wonderful wonderful national sports association, independent sports association, run by a former Olympic gold medal winner in swimming, Ms. Gerasimenia, and she has brought together many sportsmen who have left the national team of Belarus, and because they did not want to be part anymore of this abuse. And last example, one member of the athletics team at the Olympics in Tokyo, Belarusian lady, she also basically left. She was basically harassed, and then she was basically saved and protected and brought to Poland, where she is still, where she's now living, and also part of this sports team. So Russia has no influence, I think, to block that. Russia is itself blocked in many ways in sports competitions due to doping stories that you know. Scott Rowland, also good to be in touch with you. I think that question is more for Julie. We are, of course, also trying to do what we can. Many of the local employees who have worked for European companies, they have moved to other countries, in particular in the IT sector. A lot of people have moved to Lithuania, to Poland, but also to Ukraine, and even to Georgia and to other countries. And then the last thing was information and entertainment programming. Well, I think we're doing already a lot. There's a lot of European channels. The question is how long, whether they will be able to broadcast in Belarus, because there is a total mania ongoing by the regime to block each and every channel which is not fully on Lukashenko's line as you know, extremist. There's lots of Telegram channels blocked, of course, and on the TV side. I think there is possibly still some things to do, but Deutsche Welle, for instance, has been broadcasting, at least in the past. But obviously, all of this is in big danger, and fully agree that we could do even more there. If there is also time for my concluding words, just allow me just one word. Great to have many people also of the Belarusian diaspora in the US present at this meeting. I was just in Copenhagen and met lots of people from the Belarusian diaspora there, and we are trying to reach out to many of them. So happy to also to talk to you if you have an interest. Contact me if you want to know what the EU is doing. And in general terms, I think the most important thing is to say to continue supporting the Belarusian people further on in our joint efforts. And with that, we can only say, Žive Belarus. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Schuebel. Ambassador Fisher, please.
Thanks. As I have on every other comment out of Ambassador Schuebel, I will fully support what he has said, particularly on the sports pieces. I think Jennifer is exactly right that this is a particular, it is a part of the national identity, and so it is particularly powerful. Let me maybe go to the heart of Scott's question on local employees. And let me start by saying the employees whom Scott is referencing are still our employees right now today. So there's a timeline associated with these actions, and we are not there yet. So let me make sure that is understood. And I'm going to not delve into specifics. Let me say this. We have received a tremendous amount of support for our Belarusian colleagues at the embassy. And that support has come from diplomats who have served at the embassy in Minsk in the past. It has come from our leadership inside the State Department, from leadership at the Agency for International Development, from the White House and elsewhere. I would also note how much support our mission, diplomats and local colleagues alike, have from Congress. They have been incredibly important partners in supporting our policies over decades, but particularly as we have been going through this political crisis. So we have, I think, a real well of support, a real willingness to be creative and to think very innovatively about how we can best help these employees through a transition. I'm not going to necessarily go too much further into it, than that. I think that Dirk has addressed the other questions, so let me maybe turn to just one or two sentences of wrap up, and let me maybe go back, Matt, to the question of what's different. And one thing that really is different, I think, in Belarus from the past is this generation that really last summer said no more the incompetence, the leadership by those who are simply interested in enriching themselves rather than serving the state. This generation and their capabilities, right? We are seeing just how important the development of the IT sector has been in this pro-democracy movement. And I think that is a really essential element to consider in terms of, again, what is different and how do they maintain engagement from both the inside and the outside of Belarus. I deeply believe that there is such tremendous opportunity for Belarus when they move beyond this post-Soviet economy, when they will go through a transition of their own, a transition which has truly been delayed for 30 years, that a Belarus that has good relations with all of its neighbors, all of them, the opportunity for individuals to find prosperity, for individuals to develop their own opportunities and pursue a meaningful life's work, family opportunities, is going to grow so exponentially. We've talked an awful lot about some of the punitive or some of the tools of pressure that the West is bringing to bear. I would also like to just remember that there is promise at the end of this, when Belarus goes through a transition. The EU's leadership is way out in front on this in terms of trying to paint that picture of what the future can look like for Belarus. So I don't want to let this close without sounding a note of optimism in this respect.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that final note, Ambassador Fisher, and thank you also, Ambassador Schuebel. Really excellent substantive responses to a great many questions. I must, of course, apologize to those questions I didn't get to. We had a lot of people viewing today. We're grateful for that, to our speakers as well as to our audience. And we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.